Good afternoon. I wanted to welcome you all to the Introduction to Machine Learning talk today, which is being sponsored by CTR and also by the Data Science Initiative. My name is Chris Schmidt. I'm the head of the BIRD Biostatistics, Epidemiology and Research Design core of CTR. And we've set up a series of talks on machine learning. And we're going to put the link to that series in the chat. It's at our website under the machine learning series. And we're really pleased to have a lot of experts from the community who have been working on machine learning over the past several years. And they're going to be presenting their research over the next month or so. And we've asked them to present at a level that's applied, but gives you some sense of where machine learning is going at Brown, at URI, throughout the state and nationally. And you'll see those speakers in our series list. Today, we're going to have a speaker from our own bioinformatics core, and I'm going to turn that over to the director, Liz Chen, to introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm Liz Chen. I'm the director of the Biomedical Informatics, Bioinformatics, and Cyber Infrastructure Enhancement Core for Advanced CTR, and also interim director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics. It's my pleasure to welcome, to introduce Dr. Carsten Eickhoff, who is Assistant Professor of Medical Science in the Brown Center for Biomedical Informatics and Assistant Professor in Computer Science. So Dr. Eickhoff leads the Biomedical Artificial Intelligence Lab in BCBI that specializes in the development of data science and information retrieval techniques with the goal of improving patient safety, individual health, and quality of medical care. So before I hand it over to Dr. Eickhoff, who will be talking with us about Introduction to Machine Learning, a methods primer, just want to mention that we'll be pausing several times throughout the talk to take questions, so feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll do our best to address them during the talk. And if we run out of time, we'll try our best to address them afterwards. And with that, Dr. Eickhoff.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to not quite see, but I see your number, so many of you here. So I hope we'll have a fun hour together where we'll look a bit into AI and machine learning and what this is really all about. At a high level, what's the goal for today? I think AI is just so ridden with buzzwords that it might be useful to try and get some of the mystery, some of the sci-fi out of this, look at some core concepts. What do people who do machine learning and AI, I guess, really do under the label of AI? What is it that one does? What is it that one definitely doesn't do? I want to look at a few techniques and paradigms. So how does one go about this, and really try to shine a light into this somewhat obscure black box that we deal with and that we've all been hearing about over the last decade, I guess, since this has been broadly popular. Our menu for today is I'm going to start out with a few basic concepts, so really just a few keywords, a few definitions, and then I want to talk about three fundamental aspects. One is features, meaning how do I describe my data? So I have data now, which is awesome. I want to do machine learning. What do I need to do with my data in order to make it understandable to machines? The next part is the actual machine learning models. What are these AI systems? What are these machine learning models? What do they look like? And how do they work maybe on the inside? What types are there? And then for the final part, I want to look a bit more closely at learning. So what does it mean for these machines to learn, and how do we make that happen? And then we'll wrap up with a conclusion, and hopefully we should have plenty of time for questions at the end, but also, as Liz said, at some checkpoints throughout. All right, so if this sounds good, let us just jump into some basic concepts. And I want to start, and I'll not make this too dry, hopefully, but I want to start with a quick definition of what it really is that we mean by saying AI. And this is my own definition. This is not necessarily from the textbook, and there may be some disagreement on the nuances of this, but I think AI is the study of techniques to solve tasks that humans need intelligence for, and we need algorithms in order to solve these. So this is interesting and I want to highlight a few tiny aspects of this definition. So first of all, we're looking at algorithms, not computers. So if you have patience and a very large sheet of paper, you can make all of this happen on paper and just with paper and pen. Computers really only factor in later as we want to make these things happen for a lot of data, or maybe very fast. But really at its core, it's about the methods themselves, and it's really nothing but a bit of math that we need to use here in order to make these things happen. And then the second point I want to point out is this is a very human-centric definition. So I'm saying we're looking at tasks that humans need smarts for. And why is this interesting? This is maybe exciting because some of these tasks that might be hard or interesting for humans are really easy for some animals. So visual object recognition is very deeply baked into birds, for example. They don't need to learn much in order to understand what's going on there. If you look at optimization problems, so traveling salesman, for example, is baked into some single cell organisms. And they're definitely not being accused of being smart. They just have this innately in them. So really, we're looking at tasks that are interesting for humans here. So to look at a few examples, these tasks could be predicting tomorrow's weather, could be translating text from one language in another, even though I might not speak both of these languages. Maybe I don't speak either of these languages. I might want to find information within very large haystacks of information, so web search-like settings. I might want to recognize objects in images or videos, concepts in text, or I might even want to generate content myself. So can I build a machine that can write text, draw an image, or create a photo, create a video. So these are all applications. And if I somewhat closer to home, maybe look at biomedical or clinical applications, there are a few examples here, and I'm sure many of you will have seen many others. So, but it might be that I have a tissue sample and I'm curious about malignancy classification, or find the tumor. I might want to predict risk scores or make statements about how likely a patient is to take a positive versus a negative course over, say, the hospitalization, how promising a certain treatment is. I might want to try and reason automatically over health record text or maybe the literature out there. So can I use maybe these machineries to understand my patient record and then go into the wild, read all of PubMed for me, which for me as a person, this would take a long time, 30, 40 million articles. But if I use these machines, maybe I can do this within a few seconds and just get recommendations of, oh, the literature says A, B, and C relevant to this patient. So these are all examples. There are many more. But so these are things that we may want to do with machine learning techniques or with AI. Okay, so I started with AI, and you'll hear AI, you hear deep learning, machine learning, all of these. So, and I want to very quickly have a look at how these things relate to one another. Is this all the same? Are these synonyms, or is there really more to it? So AI solving problems with algorithms, and now machine learning really is studying algorithms to learn from data. And this is the interesting distinction here. So if we look at these two, AI seems to be something that's more general than machine learning. So there might be AI versions that don't learn from data at all. And many of you will be familiar with these, actually. So this is, for example, your expert systems. So very popular in the 70s and 80s and still around. So a lot of people still use these, where I don't learn from data at all. So here the idea is that this person here on the right is my domain expert. So what I collect is not data samples, but I collect people. So say I want to build an expert system on infectious diseases and how to deal with them. What I would do is I recruit experts on the topic, and I would ask them to please pour their entire brain as it pertains to infectious diseases into this knowledge base here. And then I send the expert home. So they're done. They've hopefully represented most of what they know about the topic in this knowledge base, and I won't need them anymore because I want to do this automatically. And now what I have here on the other side is my non-expert. So this might be your med student, this might be your resident, this might be even a patient. And as they now deal with infectious diseases or want to learn about that, they will interact with this user interface here and will be able to query the system. So they might say, give me your symptoms, I will query this knowledge base here, which is usually some form of rule-based engine, and then I will get advice. Right. So if you have A, B, and C, it's very likely that a bit of Tylenol will help you. If you have A, B, but then not C, but instead D, really see a doctor, maybe also which doctor to see. So you've built something that's able to automate the whole process. You don't need the expert in the loop anymore. Everyone, hopefully, if we build the system well, has access to something that's roughly equivalent to the expert's knowledge on the topic, and the expert can be at home or do other things. So that's interesting. If we look at an example, it could, for example, be something. So if we, and this is an actual from cardiac surgery, this is an actual textbook algorithm on how to deal with patients that bleed after surgery. And we'll just answer a bunch of questions. So is the patient bleeding? If not, okay, fine, we're done here. If they are bleeding, we'll look at these decisions here, and we'll ask, okay, are they bleeding for more than 400 milliliters for at least an hour already? If so, let's have surgery. Let's open the patient up, see what's going on. If not, we'll ask, are they bleeding for a bit less, but already for 3 hours? If so, surgery. Otherwise, we go here. Are they bleeding for at least 200 milliliters for more than 4 hours? If so, again, surgery. If not, we'll prescribe medication and wait what happens. So this could be a way of completely automatically encoding some expert knowledge in a way that non-experts could deal with. Now, there is, unsurprisingly, when I tell you that we used to use these things in the 70s and 80s, and maybe not so much now anymore, there's probably something wrong with this. And really what's wrong here is these systems, in order to improve, in order to build a better system, I need a better expert or more experts. This is usually pricey. It's not so clear how I would do that. So the scaling behavior is not fantastic on these. So what I want to do instead is maybe, and this is sort of now my motivation here for doing this machine learning thing, I want to try and learn from data. So can I use past examples in order to improve my systems? And in order to do that, so what machine learning strives to do is we want to have algorithms that can learn from data in general. So where previously I had my expert system for infectious diseases, and it would not help you at all for bleeding. And I have my other expert system for bleeding, and maybe I need one for fractures, and maybe I need one for the common cold. So you need systems specific to the task you want to solve there. So in general machine learning, what we care about is let's build algorithms that can learn from data in general. So we don't want to hard code, oh, if patient comes with something. No, I want to have the same method that's in principle able to distinguish dogs and cats in photos and benign and malignant tumors and maybe good from bad weather. So all of this should use the same fundamental method, and just feed it with different data in order to learn and train systems that have different behavior. So that's the ambition here. And really at the core of this is I want to get the domain expert out of the equation. These guys have better things to do. They want to do their research. They want to do their other things. So ideally, I just want to look into historic interactions with domain experts and learn from that. And then in order to make this happen, we'll usually need many historic samples in order to learn from. I'll give you a really quick example of what this could look like. So what if, for example, I wanted to classify people into whether they are male or female? That's a maybe somewhat constructed problem because it might be rather obvious who's who. But let's assume we ask anonymous people their height and their weight. And we plot these here. And now I already give you the spoiler of the sex here. But now what a machine learning model could try and do is draw a line in here. So can I construct a line that divides male from female examples, right? And as I have these lines here, as I have a new data point, such as this one, depending on which side of the line this guy falls on, I might believe that this is either a male or female sample. And really, we're getting to the very first machine learning model here, and you all know this thing from high school. So this could be your machine learning model. So this is the AI, and this is not a killer robot that will end the world, but this is really a simple model with 2 parameters. So in order to get your prediction out of the model, what you need is some parameter A times your input data plus some parameter B. So very, very simple. And you will also remember from high school that these things are lines, right? So we have a line here, and I might simply guess that this is the division. Anything to the left here, I call female. Anything to the right, I call male. And this is a pretty poor model, so this doesn't work too well. But what I can do now over time is that I try and update this. How would I learn? How would I update here? I would see for the data points for which I have labels, are they on the correct side? Right, so this guy here, correctly classified, great. I don't need to do anything. My model seems to be fantastic. And then eventually I get to all this cloud here where everyone's on the wrong side. So what I now do is iteratively, I nudge the parameters of the model. So there's the A here that I guessed might be 5, and the B that I guessed might be 810 plus 0.5. And I'll nudge them a tiny bit. And as I nudge this, for example, like this, or maybe like so, I get better and better. And then eventually I might conclude that there isn't maybe a perfect single line to do this. And I might have to look at a more complicated model that maybe has squiggles or that is allowed to have exceptions. But fundamentally, this is what we do the entire time. We take our data points that have labels and we try to fit a model such that it predicts these labels well. And I want to, as the closing point to this very first overview part here, I want to give you what I call the generalized machine learning process. And this is something that's often not necessarily highlighted like this, but I think it's very, very helpful in order to understand how machine learning works. Any machine learning paper that you'll ever read will deal with at least one of the components on this thing. So usually what you'll see is, oh, we care about this part or that part. So I just want to give you a few of the components, maybe as a bit of a key for reading these papers. So we start with data. Data is king. If you forget everything else from this talk, remember this one slide here, data is the world. And what we do with our data is we split this out into two things: features. So this was your height and your weight just now in my example. And then labels. And these labels, Y star here, are male or female. So the ground truth observation. These are things that you are able to measure about your data point, maybe your patient, maybe your sample, whatever it may be. These are things that you want your system to predict. If you don't have these things, it's going to be very, very hard to train a system that can predict something useful in this space. Right, so you need to also, when designing these machine learning studies, one important thing to think about is, do I have ground truth to even feed this algorithm to do something useful? Okay, so I take my data, everyone, I ask their height and their weight, and I know their sex. Awesome, so I have my data. And then the next step is I have a machine learning algorithm. I would feed these observations into the algorithm, and I'll learn this thing. And you remember F here was our linear regression, for example, just now. So just our straight line. And what we do then is, out of this thing, I can now get predictions. So if you again consider the straight line for any point, so if you dream up a height and a weight, it will tell you whether you're on the left or the right of this line, and whether therefore you are considered male or female under that model. So awesome. So now we have predictions Y, and we have labels Y star here. And it doesn't take too much foresight to see what we might want to be doing here. We might want to compare these guys. So I measure a height and a weight. I know the ground truth label. I have a predicted label under my model. And now I can compare these two and say, well, are they the same? Are they at least close to one another? Maybe if we have a continuous scale problem, and what can I do with this? And I call this loss, which is a bit of a strange word here, right? I could have called this evaluation, but really loss is what we call the badness of the model. So if you have a bunch of samples for which you have the outcome labels, you run those through your model and you measure how poorly your model does. And if you sum that up, that's what we call the loss. And what we want to do is iteratively shrink the loss. We want to get better and better over time. So this was this nudging my model here. And this is what we do via optimism. So we take this loss estimate, put this through some strategy for nudging the line, and we'll see that there are a few of those. And this will feed back in here. So I change the parameters of the model a bit, and the next time a data point that looks somewhat like this previous one comes along, hopefully I'm a bit more right than I was before. So these 4 blue highlighted concepts here, the features, so how do I describe my data? The loss, how do I measure how poorly my model does right now? The model itself, and strategies for optimizing the model as we go. Those are the key concepts in machine learning. You'll not find a fundamental machine learning paper, I'm daring to say now maybe, that doesn't at least deal with one of these. So usually we say we propose a new machine learning algorithm. We propose a new way of describing data and features, a new way of measuring quality or badness of our output, and a new way of learning from data over time. I want to briefly, before we go into the first of these aspects, the features, I want to briefly pause here and see whether there are any questions at this point, because this is really the big lay of the land before we jump into all of these aspects here in more detail. Is this so far, does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yep. And we actually do have a question. So
Awesome.
Are labels supposed to be dichotomous, or can they be continuous where you look at different thresholds to define a label?
They can be either categorical, they can be continuous. So this can be all of these things. It can even be a stretch of text. So if you think about generating or translating, your label might be the reference translation. And then you will want to go through and say how similar are these. So it can be all of these. We'll, for our models, we'll look into models that produce categorical data, male, female, and we'll also look into those that maybe estimate a continuous valued risk score. Always the label, again, always needs to reflect what you want the model to do. So if you want a continuous valued risk score, you have to have one for your ground truth data. If you want this discrete in 3 risk classes, you need to have that too. So that's important. And I think that's often from experience what we see, that people come with some form of data and don't really have the labels that they would like the model to produce. And then it's going to be really hard to learn these.
Great. I think that's one question for now.
Okay, very good. If that sounds sufficiently clear, let's briefly look into features. So remember, again, features are the way in which we describe our data. And we're moving along again with our high school math, which is virtually all we need for this thing. So now from our lines in space, we are moving to vectors. So numerical vectors that we can either represent in space, or we take them purely as their vector representation here. So what we want to do is, our machines like numbers. So we try to represent whatever our thing is. Maybe it's a patient, maybe it's today's weather, maybe it's an image. We need to try and bring this in a numerical representation in some form. And ideally, we like this to be just a column of numerical values. And what we do here is we try and extract key properties from the data that we think might describe this well. There are some exceptions to this nowadays, where we might just use raw data and let the machine figure out how to make features out of this. But traditionally, what we would have to do is, if I want to do this, this male versus female prediction, I should probably not measure eye color and use that as a feature. Because likely, unless there are any statistical beliefs on whether men or women are more likely to have certain eye colors or hair colors, it's not a useful feature. So height and weight might be useful. Maybe shoe size is useful. Maybe some other stereotypes that you may come up with are useful, and many, many things in the world are not. So you want to be somewhat economical. We'll talk about numbers of features later and why it's good to not just pour every possible thing that I could ask about a data point into these models, and why having fewer but more informative features is hitting harder. And in some ways, what we try to do here is walk this line of going from data, just the things that you collected, to information, which is probably these features. So I select what things should I measure for this particular task, to something that, I mean, if we're a bit ambitious here, we may want to call this knowledge, right? So we have a model that hopefully reasons on its own. And again, so the features will always have to be seen through the lens of, what is it that I want the model to predict? What is it that I want to do here? I want to look at a quick example. So say you want to encode this guy, right? So you want features that describe this little thing here, and you maybe have mice and falcons in your system, right? And the system will never see a lizard. It will never see mice of different colors. So all you want to say is, I have a data point and I want to describe this thing as either a mouse or a falcon. And you might come up with this thing. So maybe this is your feature vector, right? This should make sense. Everyone will agree that this is a perfect way of describing this as features. which is of course nonsense because I didn't tell you what these guys are. So again, features only make sense if you also know how to interpret them. So maybe this first feature is number of legs. So maybe a mouse has 4, has 2 eyes, is 3.2 inches in length on average, has a ground speed of 8.08 miles. And then maybe I even have categorical features in here. Does this thing belong to the order of rodents? If so, I encode this as a yes, a 1, or a 0 otherwise. And if I have this, you'll probably see that these are pretty good features to distinguish mice from falcons. And the more similar things get, the more nuanced I might have to get with my features, right? So if I had a feature, can it fly, then that probably would also have helped me. So really think of it in some ways as the 20 questions game. So what are the things that I should ask my data in order to make this representation very useful for doing whatever the downstream task is? Okay, I want to leave it at this. There's a whole lot more that we can think about when we think about features. There's different data types. So what about discrete 2 versus continuous 3.2 here features? What's with categorical data and so on? But I want to leave it at this. So on a high level, you want to design these things such that they support your downstream task, and also in a way that you, and this is important maybe in clinical applications often, that you actually have this data. So if you are designing a really nice feature that requires you to run some crazy expensive lab that takes you 4 days to do, and you'll definitely not be able to do this in clinical practice for everyone, this should not be a feature for something that you try and run for every patient. So you ideally should try and have features that you really prospectively in standard of care routinely collect, things that are anyway assumed to be there for the vast majority of people. If you already know that most people won't have it, it's probably a feature that you want to sacrifice and skip. Okay. Now I want to look into our models here. Really quick check-in whether features make sense.
Actually, yeah, a question just came in.
Okay, awesome.
Are there methods to extract features known and unknown from data like pictures?
Yes, there are. So we started out, so this is 90s and 2000s, by having sort of handcrafted features that look for color distribution of images, that look for edge distribution, and that would just give you a whole lot of algorithms that would compute these features, and would then transform basically an image input or maybe a waveform of audio input into, again, numerical features. So that's what we used to do back then. Nowadays, with neural networks and deep learning, there are a whole lot of techniques where we try to jointly learn not just this target function of who's male and female given fixed features, but can I jointly learn how to learn features from data and how to use these features to best predict what's going on. So nowadays, you will always want to use techniques like, for example, convolutional neural networks or dense nets for describing images. So it's an important point because images might be trickier to automatically describe, but we have good techniques for that nowadays.
Great, I think that's it for now.
Okay, awesome. So let's jump into the meat of the talk, machine learning models. Okay, we've seen this guy before. And what I highlight in red here, so this A and this B here are what we call the parameters of the model. So X is what I observe, height and weight. And all I do here is I take some parameter A, multiply that with my height and weight, add this parameter B on top of that, and this will give me some score, some likelihood of this being a man or a woman, for example. Okay, and really we might have really simple models. They might have a single parameter. So maybe we don't have this B even, so my B is 0 and I don't do anything with that. So this is the simplest model you could ever have, right? So you have your input features, you multiply that with some form of constant and you get a prediction out of it. You might have also larger models. The bigger models that we are looking at right now are looking at hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of parameters. They can't be run neither trained nor executed on a single machine or even a nice little cluster. So this requires all of Google's compute for 3 months in order to train these guys. So you have this full spectrum. And the usual rule of thumb here that we try to aim for, there are again exceptions, but most machine learning algorithms you'll see might be slow to train. So in order to learn where your line lies, that might take a moment, but they should be pretty fast to execute. If you think about this, I haven't told you yet how we nudge the line here, but if you think about execution, really it's one multiplication and one addition. So this is in the age of digital computers, lightning fast, and you could do this for tens of thousands of people in just a second. If you have a trained model, training the model might take a bit longer. So fundamentally, we'll be looking at two types of models, two types of tasks here that are probably the most heavy hitting. One is regression, which means our target values, or f of x here, is going to be continuous. So these are, can I determine a person's height from their weight? Can I determine a risk score based on maybe clinical features? Can I determine some likelihood of malignancy based on how a tissue sample looks? And then on the other hand, I have classification, which deals with discrete outcomes, which really just means I have maybe two classes, maybe I have mice and falcons, I have healthy versus diseased, I have something like this. And it can be many classes, right? It doesn't have to be two. It might be that I want to say, look at an image and tell me which digit this is, right? So this might then live in 10 classes or maybe 36 classes. I might look at a patient and I want to know what they have. If I look at open-ended diagnostic, it's probably a few thousand diseases that we know of that this patient might possibly suffer from. Okay, if we look into regression first, this is really very much what I showed you with our line here. So let's assume we have two features here, never mind what they really are. So we asked two things about each of our patients here. And we have their, or even we actually only ask one thing here. So I ask one thing here. So this is my X, and I want to regress my Y from this. And this lives somewhere between -1 and 1, let's say. So this is where my score lies. And what I could now do for a model is here have one of these linear models. Right, so I say this is what it is, and there's a bit of an error, right? So if you come with a 0.4 or whatever this may be here, or 0.3 actually, I will predict that maybe you live at 0.52 here. So for each X that you can imagine, both for these observed data points, but also anywhere here, I have a prediction. And you see that the observed data points are not fully on the line. Wouldn't have been possible with these four, but they are somewhat reasonable, right? So this is probably the best straight line that you can fit to this. If you want to go fancier, you can add more degrees of freedom to this model. So if you add another degree of freedom, you might want to be able to say, oh, maybe this line bends here, right? It's a bit of a polynomial, or you may want to do something like this. All I want to show you with this is that you will always be able to build a model that can perfectly fit your data, where every single training data point is perfectly represented. This may not make sense, and this may not be what you want. So it's really important to not lie to yourself and not trick yourself into believing, oh, I have the perfect model. So if we believe that the real law looks something like this, the real physical law, right? So maybe it's a squiggly line that runs here. If I look at a polynomial like this here, right, I would be, for this entire regime here, I would be way off with my predictions. They're down here, my real law lies somewhere down here. So now I have come to a point where my loss is 0. So every single data point is exactly on the prediction line here, but I have a pretty bad model in this range here. So this is why, and we'll get to that later, while we work with held out samples, where we say, okay, here's some data that the model was never allowed to train on, and now I'll measure how good or how bad the model is. Okay, but so this is regression. Classification is pretty similar, but now we have, instead of continuous outcomes, we have discrete ones. So say we have photos as input, and we want to distinguish these guys from these guys, right? And I hopefully have tens of thousands of examples here, and I have my K classes. We talked a bit about these already. So it might be something that lives somewhere between 2 and many, many, many classes. And the important thing here, which comes with an asterisk, but I'll skip the asterisk for now. The important thing here is you need to know all the classes from the start. So if you say dogs and cats and you train on that, it's always dogs and cats. It's never lizards. So it's really important to be aware of what do I want the model to do, and I need to have training data for all of these. The asterisk is there are some models that are more cutting edge researchy that try to reason over things that were never seen in training. So if I have dogs and cats and lizards, maybe, can I describe likelihood of lizard by similarity to dogs and cats? But this is really tricky. Your run-of-the-mill machine learning system will not do well at all under these settings. What you want to do is for every class that you want to be able to deal with, have examples, have many examples, ideally have equally many examples. So half dogs, cats. If you do have data for dogs, cats, and lizards, make it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 if you can. Okay. So these are most things that you'll see in machine learning are falling into this category of supervised machine learning. I have labels with which I can supervise the learning process. But what happens if I don't have these, right? So our model, our labels might be the product of some pretty expensive annotation process. So I might have, again, domain experts, and they do something to my data in order to annotate this. And I might not be able to have much of this. So can I skip this process and still make sense of my data? The answer is yes, but it gives you something that's more describing your data rather than giving you predictions. So what I could do is, okay, I don't have these labels Y star here, but I have features. So I know height and weight of people. And what I could want to do is say, is there any interesting salient pattern in height and weight? And often as the very first step of a machine learning project, you might do something like this, unsupervised learning, where you don't yet care about the classes quite as much. And you just say, well, here's the data plotted in whatever high dimensions that we have. Let's see whether there are subpopulations that are more similar to one another than they are to randomness. So you could look at something like this. So I have data. It doesn't have colors here. So everything is blue because I didn't have labels. I have an X1, something that I could measure, an X2, something that I could measure. And I just want to say, is there anything that's interesting here? And there's a whole bunch of, for example, clustering techniques that look at this. So they might, for example, say, oh, look, the density here is somewhat higher than uniform distribution throughout the space. So maybe this actually is some coherent subpopulation that I might want to look at. There are a whole bunch of techniques that do this, and that might, for example, give you something like this. Right? So they might say, I see some density of distribution here, over here, and here. And then you can go in and say, okay, now with my domain expertise, I go in and I have a look at this data and see maybe there are any interesting properties that make what I color in red now tentatively truly different from the blues and from the greens. So this is often interesting before we go in and smack the big supervised hammer on everything and say, okay, you're either a dog or a cat, to really see actually your data while you believe everything has a dog and cat label, that's what you collected. Truly, there are some weird dogs out here that look a whole lot like cats, and you should maybe consider either excluding those or doing something special with them. Okay. And then the final type of models that I want to touch on in this chapter of the talk is, so previously we've looked at supervised, we have labels, unsupervised, we don't have labels. There's a third paradigm that is very popular, especially in the robotics world, which is reinforcement learning. So here the idea is, again, we don't have training examples as such. So we don't collect data even, but I learn by trying. So I have some form of reward function that tells me, oh, what you did, your model is good, or what you did, your model is bad, and I'll tap you on the fingers. And I let this model loose in some form of observable world, could be a computer game, for example. And I'll just let the model do whatever it does. And I'll just sit on the sidelines and comment each action. Right, so the model, so this Super Mario game from the whatever 90s here, I guess, has a bunch of actions. I have them here. So these are the buttons that you as a human would have on the controller. And the model now has the freedom to do any of these things. So I can run, I can jump, I can do whatever these things do. And every time you do that, I'll give you points or I'll tap you on the finger. So if you collect coins that are floating around here, maybe that's a good thing. If you fall into this chasm here, maybe you die, and that's a very bad thing. And over time, so again, I didn't show you examples of, oh, this was you doing a good thing and this was you doing a bad thing historically, but instead I really just let you play this thing for 10,000 hours, and I'll just patiently sit there By sitting there, I mean there's some automated function that can do this, right? You don't do this by hand, and you'll train the model in this way. So this is how all your modern chess and Go and game computers, all your robots are being trained, right? If you want to train a robot how to walk on its own without injecting that knowledge beforehand, you just say, well, here you go, you have muscles, figure it out, and every time that you manage to not fall on your face, I'll give you a little bonbon. And with many, many bonbons, you learn how to do this walking thing. Okay. So this was the very quick overview of machine learning models. Are there questions on this part? There's a whole lot more to be said on these, but since we are somewhat limited in time, I'm going to leave it at that for the time being. But if we have questions, I'm very happy to take them here.
Not seeing any questions, so I think it's okay to proceed.
Okay, interesting. Okay, the final topic of today is learning. So I always somewhat hand-wavingly have glossed over this. Oh, we'll nudge the line and we'll get a bit better there. I want to in this last part of today look into a few considerations of how we actually make this happen. So how does the model learn? So what we do is we have our parameters. So remember the A and the B maybe in our very simple model, and we'll start out just initializing them randomly. So we don't sit down and we say, oh, from the literature, I know it should really be 1.5 here and 2 there or something. So again, the mission being get away with domain knowledge. So you don't want to have any knowledge about the problem. So you want to translate Croatian to, I don't know, Swahili, and you don't know either of these things. And you want to learn from data. So you initialize your parameters randomly. So you really just guess what are nice numbers for A and B. And this obviously gives you random behavior. Right, so your model will obviously, if you make it random, you will get random. And now you have your data, and you make predictions for the data for the points on the data set, and you'll compare with these ground truth labels. And now you want your model to get a tad closer to the correct prediction here via your loss. And I'm going to give you this as a bit of a visual representation. So let's believe you have 2 things that you measure, right? So height and weight maybe. Each of these has their parameter that goes with it, right? So you take your height, multiply that by something, take your weight, multiply that by something else, and that gives you a model score. That model score is sometimes correct, sometimes it isn't, right? Remember, some data points were on the wrong side of this model. And what you can now do is you could plot this thing here. So if you had a whole lot of time, you could plot this landscape, and you could say, for any choice of the first parameter that looks at height, and any choice that looks at the weight parameter, I would have a model. And some of them are more accurate. These are going to be low down here. So the error that I'm measuring on this axis here is going to be low. And for some of them, it's going to be really high, right? So the hotter models here, so the reds and the yellows are really bad models. And since we said I randomly initialize these, so that really just means I throw a dart somewhere in this X and Y landscape and I get a model. And that has some random performance, right? So it's probably going to be pretty poor. Now, what I do is every time I see data points from this model, I look at the derivative of my error surface. So I can't plot this entire thing, right? So there are infinitely many choices, even for 2 parameters, even for 1 parameter alone, that I could make here. So I'll have a hard time doing this. Instead, what I do is I start here. I can measure how bad I am right now where I am here, and I can compute the gradient of this loss surface. So I might not know how the world looks like over here, but I know in this point, if I were to go this way, things would get worse. So this is not the direction to go. If I would go here, maybe things stay the same. If I go here, they stay the same. But lo and behold, over here, this looks like a slope, right? And you can only see, if you will, from the point where you're standing, you can't see the full landscape, but you can see, oh, it seems to go down here in this direction. So that means you adjust your parameters a bit in this direction. Right, so you take some step size and you say, okay, what was previously, and I'm really just guessing here, let's say 0.7 and 0.4, I want to nudge this to 0.5 and 0.4. Right, so I adjust my model, and again, I take out my training data, run it through the model, and I measure that now, yeah, my overall error is a bit better. So that's great, I learned a bit. And again, I can play this game and say, okay, in which direction from where I'm standing right now do I see a slope that goes down in the direction of lower error? Oh, it seems to be this way. So I take another step, adjust my parameters a bit, and measure here. And as eventually I walk along this path, and I'll eventually get into this valley where I can't improve anymore. There are some techniques for trying to get out of these local values. So if you see here globally, there would have been a really nice solution here with a pretty low error. And this one is maybe not quite as good, but really I'm in this saddle point here where wherever I go, I would have increasing error, right? So I'm in this bowl. And there are some techniques for getting out of this. But at a high level, this is what we do, right? So now if you imagine that I said some of these models have hundreds of billions of parameters, not two, and so this is going to be harder to plot. But even in 100 billion dimensions, this is exactly what happens, right? So we try to assess where am I right now, local to where I am, where do things get better? Let's move in the direction of better and see what we get once we are there. Okay. And again, this needs nothing more than high school mathematics. So if you're fine with partial derivatives, you're actually there and you can build your own machine learning model. So really all of us learned in high school how to do all of these things. Okay, two more quick considerations and then I hope we have lots of questions. So I talked a bit about generality earlier, right? So you will always be able to perfectly overfit your data. So how do I ensure that my data is also robust? So I don't just build this machine learning model, I sell it to all kinds of customers, and they all say your model really sucks. It really doesn't work at all for me. How do I avoid going bankrupt with my company like this? I will, out of the data that I do have, for which I have features and labels, I will withhold some portion, train only on the first portion. Now, on the second portion, I evaluate. And this could look something like this. So maybe I have this much data here, this bar. I take this here for training and I do exactly what I described to you, right? So I have my random model and I do this walk in this error surface and get better and better, hopefully. And I have this test data set. So every now and then I peek at the test data set and I say, I don't adjust my parameters there. I really only say, how bad would I be if I would ship this model, right? And you can measure. And you'll see that this is usually performance here because you were able to see these guys and they come by time and again, and you get better with these. You will see that performance here is usually a bit lower. And you could even do this, and many people do this, split this in something like 80, 10, and 10% of your data, where you have something that you can use for training, so for actually fitting the parameters of your model. Something that you have for validation. This is sort of your engineering. So do I want this type of model or that type of model? And you can compare them on this thing here. And then finally you have test. And really on test, you're not allowed to do anything other than just run it through, measure performance, and say, this is the performance we got. And the test here, the green part, really is the simulation of what would happen in the wild. If I were to actually ship this model now as a product, give this to a peer institution, to a peer researcher, what have you, this is the performance that I might expect to see. And then the final consideration for today is what we charmingly call the curse of dimensionality. So we've seen that features are important for making things learn, and having the right features is super important for getting good models here. Again, based on people's eye color, trying to classify whether they are male or female or have really any other property might be really hard. So you could come up with this idea of, oh, I'll just have a whole load of features, right? So you could say, okay, let me just have thousands and thousands of things that I ask every patient. And then probably just with this shotgun approach, I'll have the right stuff in there as well. Okay. But having too many of these may make your learning slow. Maybe, but more fundamentally, it might also induce a very, very sparse space in which you don't really know anything about your features. And I'm just quickly, I think this is something that you can understand very easily graphically. Looking at this, let's believe you have a single feature. So you ask each patient just one thing, and you have your, whatever these are, probably 20 data points or so. So they're pretty densely distributed on this one axis. If I ask each patient another thing, so I have height and weight, same number of data points, but there's a lot more distance between them, right? So they are not quite as crowded anymore. So that really means that some sectors of my data, even though I have the exact same amount of data in some ways, I don't understand at all. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know what's going on here. My model has no clue. And you already see how this goes, right? So as I add a third thing, so this is just 3 features, not thousands yet, and the space gets sparser and sparser, right? So this really means that if I linearly increase the number of features, so I add one, I exponentially would have to increase the number of data points in order to keep the density with which I populate the space constant, right? And this really tells us a bit about this pretty sensitive trade-off of the more features I have, really the more data I should have in order to understand these features and they interplay well. And that's really all the content I have for you today. Let me just real quick wrap up with the conclusion, and then I think we have a bunch of questions. So what I hopefully introduced to you today is machine learning as a general way of learning from data, learning from historic examples. We use features to describe this data in a way that's machine understandable and that's useful for these algorithms. We start with random initialization, so we usually don't put smarts or domain knowledge into this. And then we really just iteratively play this game of hiking in the direction of lowest error to improve our predictions. And really one of the big challenges in practice is doing these things where it matters. So we often see prediction models that are pretty accurate, but they predict a thing that's not clinically actionable. So really, this comes with this joint challenge of doing the right thing, as in doing the right machine learning technique from an engineering point of view, and doing the right thing as in predicting the right label that's actually useful, right? So if this is a label that makes you shrug and say, okay, but I can't intervene here, that person will still die, or whatever we predict pretty accurately will happen, will still happen, that's maybe not the best thing to invest your time on. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm really curious to hear about your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Carsten. That's been a really great introduction, I think, hopefully for everyone. So you have a number of questions. I'll try to group some of them, but the first one that came in was, do you mean that learning by trying is like trial and error?
This is for the reinforcement learning part, I guess.
Yes, I think it came in. I think this one came in when you're talking about loss and optimization.
Okay. So yes, in many ways, it's a big trial and error machine. The big difference between supervised and reinforcement learning is in supervised learning, I have historic data. So I really just say, if I look at all the historic patients maybe that I've seen in the past, or all the historic tissue samples, how could I learn some form of model that does pretty well if patients behave like they did in the past? Now, these reinforcement learners, they just run around and try things out. Which is why they are somewhat tricky maybe in clinical practice, right? So you don't want this thing to go, I wonder what happens if I inject this stuff into a person, and you have all kinds of people die. So that's not what you want. So you would have to work with simulations there, or kickstart with maybe with historic data, but in some way, this is what's happening. So in tasks where maybe an error doesn't matter so much, so chess, for example, you would have this game try out a whole load of nonsensical moves that are allowed by the rules of the game, but not really conducive to winning the game, until it learns that, oh, this is how I win. So it's a big trial and error machine, these reinforcement learners.
Great, okay. The questions keep coming in, but there's a number of questions about unsupervised learning, so I'll try to cover a few in this next one. So one is, does unsupervised learning require knowing the ground truth? There's also a question about how does loss and optimization work with unsupervised learning? And then also a question about what's the equivalent for validation with unsupervised learning?
Yeah, okay, awesome. Does this, so what was number one? Does this work?
Does it require knowing the ground truth?
Oh, yes. So this can help you, but it doesn't require it. So if you remember this example where I had this blue cloud that I subdivided into 3 colors, if truly you know there are 3 underlying colors, or maybe it's even 4, you could do interesting things there, and you could say, oh, my unsupervised model is actually already pretty good at telling apart these real classes. That's nice. But even if you don't have this yet, so maybe you didn't send this to your expensive domain expert for annotation yet, and you really just want to figure out, oh, how does my data distribute? You could do that. And most unsupervised learning techniques are, are constructed to allow for exactly that. And then the loss and optimization on this part, this works very differently. So either you have some form of heuristic that you want to enforce, or also where you look at maybe density of distribution, or you really only have a model that follows some predefined algorithm, right? So for example, finding these color clusters here, where you say it's locally more dense than it is globally, you really just follow these rules of thumb to doing that. So you wouldn't do this this gradient descent walk, for example, in most cases. What was the third one that we had on this? Sorry.
It's about validation. So is there
right
for validation?
Not really, I mean, you could do something where you have a held out set where then you go in and say, okay, does my held out set still believe what my clusters believe? But really validation and test sets are a thing of supervised learning.
So another question, do you know if anyone has tried to use the NVIDIA model that created this person does not exist.com and applied to medical imaging CTs or MRIs to have this model generate fake medical imaging?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of work on this. So these generative models, so GANs and friends that can generate data for you. I know a bunch of techniques that use this for medical, so in the radiology domain, for example. So we've just published a paper myself, for example, where we try and use this for classification. So we care about chest X-rays, and we have normals and abnormals. But they might not always be comparable. So what we did was for each patient with their very own anatomy, we tried to generate that same patient, but as a pseudo normal. So can I make that diseased patient normal with maybe without pneumonia, let's say, and then use that as a part of classification. So there's a bit of work on this at the moment.
Okay. Here's another one. How do you interpret a model after it's been built and tested, for example, to determine it's clinically useful, et cetera?
So what you would do next, so say it's indeed trained and validated and whatnot. So this means it will have some form of sensitivity, specificity, some F-score, something that tells you, well, this model is roughly this bad, and maybe you have confidence intervals on this. So that's the first step. The second step then is usually that you look at the errors. You'll rarely have models that are perfect, just like people are not perfect at these tasks. And you would look at what types of errors do I make? So is this model, is there an interesting form of bias in there? So do all the errors cluster for certain demographics, certain ethnicities, certain genders maybe, right? So is this model equally bad or good for everyone? Or is there some system to the error? And if there is, this is interesting because this might inform our next revision of the model. And certainly it sort of gives you the limitation section where you know, well, it's 90% accurate, but really beware if you're older than 80 because we know the model is really poor there. So error analysis is a very important step there.
Great. So we probably have 4 or 5 more questions. Are you okay to keep taking them beyond 1 or?
I have 5 more minutes, so I in theory have my next meeting now. I can be a bit late for that, but let's keep going for a moment.
Okay, why don't we take 1 or 2 more questions? I think we'll be recording all of these, so if we don't get to your question, we'll try to follow up afterwards.
Yeah, and also before we go into just reach out via email, chat with me. I'm always happy to talk about these, right?
Yeah, and I can see also someone asked for resources. So one of the things we're hoping to do is start putting up readings, other resources, and welcome your feedback of what would be most helpful, and we can make those available through the CTR site. So another question, for cursive dimensionality, is there a way to analyze which dimensions maximize the grouping of data, as in a certain combination of parameters make more distinct data groups?
Yeah. So you may have heard about principal component analysis, for example, PCA, which is one of these things where we look at which of the features, but also which combinations of features are most indicative. So where do I see most variance in the data? Because that's usually what I'm after. So I usually don't want, so say you have a feature that has the exact same value for every single data point, right? So if you have only male patients, if you ask them for their gender, it's a pretty boring affair. So these are features that you want to get rid of. And usually that's what we tend to do. So either we weed out features that are uninformative, and we can test that. So you could test this either because there's low variance or there's a weak correlation with your outcome that you want to predict, or you say, I project my data onto fewer dimensions. This is what PSCA tends to do, and some nonlinear equivalents of that as well. So take 1,000 features that I had, project this down to 10 features that are somewhat linear combinations or maybe nonlinear combinations of all of these. So there's a lot of techniques for this.
Great. Okay, we'll do 1 more. So if the label is not metric like category A or B, for example, let's say this chemical can bind protein A, protein B, or both protein A and B, how can we create labels and loss functions?
Right. So you would, in cases where your label is something complex, you would probably try and discretize that. So you would probably say, If your outcome is something like A, B, or A and B, you would probably make all of these discrete classes. So you wouldn't make that a 3-class classification problem in these cases. And maybe you have many, many more interesting properties like these. So you would really make a separate class for A and B, so binds with 2 things, let's say.
Great. Okay, so I think we'll probably need to wrap it up for now. We see there's a lot of great questions in there, and sorry we're not able to get to them, but we'll definitely record them and aim to get back to you. But thank you all so much for attending the first in our series of 5 talks. Thank you so much for Dr. Eickhoff for a great talk. I think it was very comprehensive, gave a really nice introduction to machine learning. And I think we welcome your feedback. I think there's going to be a survey, so give us feedback. We'd like to see what more we can share, what more we can do, develop resources, additional seminars. Oh, it says here on the slide, yep, survey to follow. So thank you for attending. And then our next talk is next Friday. And then there'll be 3 more after that. But thank you again. And thank you, Dr. Eickhoff.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care. Have a good weekend.